All right, so let's talk about solving quadratic equations. So, what is a quadratic equation? Well, a quadratic equation is a second degree polynomial, and here is an example of a second degree polynomial. Now, what exactly is that? Well, a degree or the degree of a polynomial is its highest power. So, if you have a polynomial equation and the highest power is 2, well, you have a quadratic equation. Now, sometimes we need to use the quadratic formula to solve a quadratic equation, but not every time. Now, if you have to use the quadratic formula, there is a lot of steps involved, and students or people make a lot of common mistakes. So this video is going to be talking about when and how to use the quadratic formula to solve a quadratic equation. But let's see how well you actually understand the quadratic formula. So if you think you can solve this equation right here, we have x squared minus 4x is equal to 8. Go ahead and put your answer into the comment section. I'm going to show you the correct solution in just 1 second. Then, of course, I'm going to thoroughly review what the quadratic formula is and when and how to use it and how to avoid very common mistakes. All right, so let's take a look at the answer again. We have x squared minus 4x is equal to 8. The correct solution here is x is equal to 2 plus or minus 2 times the square root of 3. And there's actually two solutions here. So we have our first solution, which would be 2 plus 2 times the square root of 3. And our second solution would be 2 minus 2 times the square root of 3. All right, now, if you got this right, well, you definitely get a happy face and an A plus. And if you're like, Mr. U2 Math Man, I thought I knew this. What went wrong? Well, you probably, again, made a very common mistake. So don't get discouraged, but you definitely need to understand the quadratic formula. All right, so let's go and get into this right now. So here is our quadratic equation that we're going to be doing in this problem or this video. So x squared minus 4x is equal to 8. Now, let's suppose you just run across this problem on a test, quiz, exam, homework. Well, I'm telling you to use the quadratic formula, but you, as a student or somebody who wants to solve this equation, you don't want to just say, all right, hey, I'm going to be using the quadratic formula. First of all, we need to identify what type of equation it is. So we already discussed that. We have a second degree polynomial equation, so it is a quadratic equation. So what do we know about quadratic equations? All right, so here are some fundamental things that you need to understand about any and all quadratic equations. The first thing that you need to understand is that there's always going to be two solutions. Okay, so here it's a second degree polynomial equation. So there's this thing called the fundamental theorem of algebra. Basically, it says the degree, which is the highest power of that equation, is how many solutions you're going to have. So this particular equation, we're going to have two solutions. Now, those solutions can be real or imaginary or complex. We don't know that, but we do know that we are going to have two solutions. Okay, so let's talk about the various techniques we could possibly use to solve this equation. Again, we're going to have two solutions. So what are some techniques that you can use to solve quadratic equations? Well, there's various different types. So the first thing we could consider is taking the square root of both sides. In other words, if I had like x squared is equal to 16, this would be the perfect candidate to solve this quadratic equation by taking the square root of both sides. But when we have a middle term, see here we have x squared, but we don't have an x term. But when we have a term like this, a middle term, i.e. we have some sort of trinomial situation, well, then we're going to want to try to factor, okay? Now, you may not be able to factor, and if you cannot factor, well, then you can always rely and solve every single quadratic equation by the quadratic formula. That is why this formula is so important, is that these techniques you can solve if the equation is set up or if it's in a particular format where you can use these methods, right, by taking the square root or by factoring, but every single quadratic equation can be solved by the quadratic formula. And there is another cool technique called completing the square, which is kind of like the long version of the quadratic formula. It's something you need to understand, and a lot of students get confused about this as well. But we're going to be concentrating here on the quadratic formula. Okay. All right. So just a quick review of some things that you should know. If you're watching this video and you have to solve quadratic equations, these are things that you need to keep in mind. Okay. So let's get into some mistakes now. So the first mistake that students make is that they'll look at a quadratic trinomial to be like, oh, look it, I have a quadratic equation. It's x squared x minus 6. And the first thing they think is like, oh boy, I want to use the quadratic formula. Okay. Well, that's mistake number one. You don't want to just jump in right away, see the quadratic trinomial and just be like, I'm going to use a quadratic formula. No, no, no. You're going to want to try to factor. Okay. Try to factor first. So mistake number one is students use the quadratic formula where it's not necessary, and really it's going to cause a lot more work for you. Okay, so in this particular case, we have x squared minus x minus 6. This trinomial can be factored into x plus 2 times x minus 6. So mistake number one is students not trying to factor a quadratic trinomial first. Okay, you always want to try to factor. Now, the reason why students may not want to try to factor is because they forgot how to factor. They're like, oh boy, wait a minute here, factoring? I forgot how to do that, so I'm just going to break out the quadratic formula. Okay, well, don't do that. You want to try to factor, because when you can factor, okay, when you can find the factors of a quadratic trinomial, and these are called linear factors. So these are two binomials. So x squared minus x minus 6 can be factored as x plus 2 times x minus 3. Well, this is super easy to solve because we can just simply set each factor equal to 0, because we have something times something else that's equal to 0. This is an example of something called the zero product property. So we can set x plus 2 is equal to 0 and x minus 3 is equal to 0 and solve for x for each one of these little equations. So we get x is equal to negative 2. That is one solution. And x is equal to 3. That is our second solution. Again, two solutions for these quadratic equations. Okay, so again, you only want to use the quadratic formula, okay, when you can't do these other techniques. You're like, okay, I'm going to have to use a quadratic formula, because the quadratic formula does take a considerable amount of work. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at this problem now. So the second mistake that students make is, this is the problem that we're going to be doing, and this particular problem cannot be factored. So I'll just tell you that right now. So the second mistake that students make is that they don't put their quadratic equations into standard form. In other words, standard form, we go back up to the actual quadratic equation. This is an equation in standard form. You have to have it to get our a, b, and c values. We have to have our quadratic equation written from highest to lowest power. Okay, so you can't identify what a, b, and c are unless you have your equation in standard form. So a lot of students, they'll just kind of forget that part. They'll be like, oh, this is A, this is B, this is C. That's incorrect. What that means is to put an equation in standard form is to get all the terms on the left-hand side of the equation and set that equal to 0. Okay, so in this case, we need to move this 8 over and make sure that everything is written from highest to lowest power. Okay, so we have x squared minus 4x minus 8, and the numbers, okay, the coefficients here are going to be our a, b, and c values. So I guess I can kind of define this as two mistakes, is that students, one, don't put their quadratic equations into standard form properly, and two, if they do that, they may not identify the correct A, B, and C values. You have to be very careful here. Okay, so that is another place where students make errors. So again, everything I'm telling you here, you just need to have high situational awareness when you are trying to solve a quadratic equation using the quadratic formula. Okay, so now that we have our A, B, and C formulas, we need to go ahead and plug in those respective values into the quadratic equation. So this is going to be minus b plus or minus b squared minus 4ac over 2a. Now this is another place where students make a lot of errors. Now you might be saying, well, what is it, Mr. YouTube Math Man? You didn't tell me what the error was. Well, the error is plugging in these respective values, okay, right here's a into the equation. Here's c right here. and then we got to plug in b right here and right here. Students actually plug in the wrong results, okay? And I'm going to highly suggest that you use parentheses when you plug things in, and do not move forward, okay, with your setup or the remaining work until you double, triple check that you have the correct ABC values and you correctly plugged in these values. Okay, so if you want to go ahead and try to plug in, if you're kind of, watching this video and you didn't try the problem yet, but you're like, yeah, let me see if I can actually plug these in correctly, you might want to pause the video and get a piece of paper out and a pencil and see if you can actually set this thing up properly. Okay, again, a lot of students rush this and they plug in the wrong information, and then it doesn't make a difference. Even if they set up the problem correctly, the work is wrong. All right, so this is the proper setup. We have minus b plus or minus square root b squared. Now notice I have things in parentheses, minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay, so this is the proper setup. And again, a lot of students make mistakes just by plugging in the wrong numbers. They have the wrong, and this is really common, especially when you have negative values in your A, B, C values. So here, like minus B, this is another classic place where this is right here, this minus B, you have a minus because B is what? Well, it's -4. Okay, so you got to be super, super careful. Again, a lot of errors made right here. Okay, so when you get to this part of using the quadratic formula, you want to really just take a couple deep breaths and be like, okay, double, triple check everything, because from this point forward, we have to use the order of operations to simplify all this stuff. And of course, there's a lot of opportunities to make further mistakes, which I'm going to highlight, as we, continue on. Now, if you're like, I'm going to go ahead and see if I can fully simplify this, because what are we dealing with here? Well, we're just dealing with number crunching, right? Don't use your calculator. See if you can kind of clean this up. But this is going to require multiple steps. All right, so here is our setup. Now, when you are using the quadratic formula, you need to have the discipline to just kind of take one or two steps at a time. Okay, there's a lot of number crunching going on. You don't want to kind of just do it all in, one or two steps, because you're like, what, I really want to get done with my math so I can move on and do something more interesting like video games. You got to take your time with this, and you got to double, triple check. So if you're not neat and organized, okay, and double, triple checking your work, that right there is a mistake in and of itself. So students rush and they're not neat, not organized, and they're not used to taking one step at a time. Okay, so let's just go ahead and start looking through this problem. We have minus 4. Okay, so the opposite of a -4 is 4. Now, another mistake here, it's just basic stuff that students don't even know, positive and negative numbers or order of operations. That right there, you're going to have to, review. By the way, if you really need to learn this stuff, you're like, yes, this is what I need. I'm going to suggest that you check out my Algebra 1, Algebra 2, or Pre-Calculus courses. You'll find links to all of those in the description. This is where you get my full best instruction on all this, to include notes and example prompts, etc., etc. All right, so let's just do one thing at a time. Minus 4 is 4, plus or minus the square root of -4 squared. Now, if you had not used parentheses, you might have written this as -4 squared. -4 squared is -16. Okay, that is not what we want to do. Remember, you had a variable. This is b squared. You want to replace that variable using parentheses. So -4 squared is +16. So again, other common mistakes. The quadratic formula, in terms of teachers grading works, students' work in quadratic form, there's so many mistakes. It's crazy, and there are a lot of basic stuff too. All right, so -4 squared is +16, or -4 squared, minus 4 times 1 times -8. This right here, this is another place where students make a ton of errors. So this minus part, b squared minus 4ac, by the way, I have a pop quiz question for you. Let's see how much of an algebra superstar you are. What is this part of the quadratic formula called? B squared minus 4ac. This part of the quadratic formula has a specific name. Do you know what that is? Well, if you do know what that is, put that in to the comment section and tell me why that is important. Okay, so I'm going to give you the answer right now. This is called the discriminant, and this is extremely important because it tells us the type of roots or solutions we're going to have because we were dealing with a square root. If all of this right here turns out to be a negative number, what type of solutions do we have? Well, we're going to have complex and imaginary number solutions. If this is a positive number, then we'll have real number solutions. So that's a whole different deal. But here is another pop quiz question. What happens if all this is equal to 0? Okay, what type of roots do we have? Okay, well, if you know the answer, put that into the comment section. You're going to have double roots. So a lot of you are probably getting kind of sad. You're like, Mr. YouTube Math Man, I only understand maybe 50% of this stuff because you keep telling me things I didn't even know about the quadratic formula. Well, listen, don't despair. If you, check out one of my courses or more of my videos on YouTube, you'll understand all of this. But again, things like this are topics that students, they're like, I know the quadratic formula. Yeah, they don't really know it well enough. Okay, they maybe know half of it. But let's continue on and help you avoid just making mistakes, employing this formula. Okay, so another great thing you can do here to help you not make this mistake, and the mistake I'm talking about here is not getting the sign right. So we're subtracting 4 times 1 times -8. What I like to tell students is take this negative and turn it into a plus negative. So that 4 is you kind of see that as a -4. So instead of minus b squared, well, here, let me just do it this way. So you look at this a formula, b squared minus 4ac. Okay, that is the formula. Think of it this way, b squared minus 4ac. If you think of the formula this way, b squared plus -4 times a times c, this helps students avoid making these errors. Now, I'm telling you things, techniques, and strategies that I've used to help students thousands and thousands over years and years and years. So all these little tricks and techniques will definitely help you out. Okay, so -4 times 1 times a -8. So we have a negative times a positive. You got to really pay attention here. It's going to be a negative, so negative times another negative is going to be positive. So 4 times 1 times 8 is going to be positive 32. So again, students make mistakes right in here with the sign. Okay, so here is where we're at. Then we have 2 times 1. We'll just have that as 2. Okay, so let's continue on here. So we have 4 plus or minus the square root of 16 plus 32 over 2. So the next thing here is to add 16 plus 32. So, of course, that is going to be 48. All right, so here's where we're at. We have x is equal to 4 plus or minus the square root of 48 over 2. Now, if you got this right here as your answer, I would say you did pretty well. Okay, you were on the way. Now, this is technically, the values here are correct in terms of the solutions, but you did not fully simplify, and your teacher will not, likely give you full credit for this answer. Okay, this is like turning in, a fraction problem where you said, oh, my answer is 100 over 200. Well, your student's going to be like, how come you didn't write 1/2? And they'll be like, well, I just didn't want to do that. And then they'll say to you, well, I don't want to give you full credit for your solution. Okay, so you have to know how to simplify these expressions, and it comes down to your ability to simplify radicals, okay, and square roots with perfect squares. So you can see there is a lot to know here when it comes to dealing with the quadratic formula. All right, so let's go ahead and take the step of simplifying this square root of 48. So we have to ask ourselves, are there any perfect squares in this 48? Okay, so in other words, can we factor 48 in terms of a perfect square? Now, if you don't even know what I'm talking about here, you're going to have to review how to simplify square roots and radicals. But effectively, what we can do here is a square root of 48 is the same thing as a square root of 16 times 3, because 16 times 3 is 48. 16 is a perfect squared factor. And that's perfect squares are numbers like 4, 9, 16, 25, etc. Because when I take the square root of these numbers, you get a lovely integer value. But here is the deal. When I can write the square root of 48 as a square root of 16 times 3, but I can break up this big square root into individual square root factors. So I could write this as the square root of 16 times the square root of 3. That is a property of square roots and radicals. And now here, I could take the square root of 16. That's going to be 4. So that's going to be 4 times the square root of 3. So the square root of 48 is 4 square root of 3. So again, we're not even done with this problem. There is a lot of opportunities and a lot of steps to make. So if you're like, Mr. YouTube Math Man, I don't like this stuff. This is why I don't like algebra. Well, listen, all you need to do is understand the mistakes, avoid these mistakes, and practice, practice, practice. So don't get discouraged, by any of these steps. Just, make a list of skills that you need to improve. Okay, so now let's go and continue on because here we still have more work to do. So I know that's exciting for a lot of you out there, like, yay, yay, more work to do. So we have 4 plus or minus the square root of 48 over 2. Remember, the square root of 48 now, we simplified as 4 square root of 3. So this is our problem, but we are not done because notice up here in the denominator we have 4 and we have a 2 down here. Well, we can factor out a common factor of 2, okay? Or actually factor out a common factor of 4, right? So here I have 4 plus or minus 4 square root of 3. We can factor out a 4, so 4 parentheses 1 plus or minus square root of 3. We can write it this way because if I multiply the 4 back in, I get back to this. Now, why do I want to do that? Because I have this 2 down in the denominator, and this 2 can go into that 4 2 times. So let's go ahead and take that step right now. So 2 goes into 4 2, and then I could just take this 2, parentheses 1 plus square root of 3, and then just distribute the 2 back in, right? So here, I could do, well, let me just show you the work right here. So this is what we did when we factored out the GCF of the numerator, which was 4. Now I can go ahead and distribute that 2 back in. So x is equal to 2 plus or minus 2 square root of 3. Okay, so I hope this video helped you out. And if that's the case, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, if you need additional help in algebra, check out these courses right here. So pre-algebra is for those of you that are studying basic algebra. But if you are further along in mathematics, then you may want to check out my Algebra 1 or Algebra 2 courses. Now, my Math Skills Rebuilder course is a review course. I cover basic math, algebra, and geometry in this course. I'm going to leave links to all these courses in the description of this video. All right, so with all that being said, I definitely wish you all the best in your math adventures. Thank you for your time and have a great day.